The year was 1939. The world stood on the edge of chaos. The Great War had ended just 2 decades earlier, but the scars it left were still deep. Europe was fragile, its people hungry, its nations divided, and its leaders desperate for power. Out of the ruins of the First World War rose a man whose ambition would ignite the deadliest conflict in human history: Adolf Hitler. Germany had been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. The country was forced to pay crushing reparations. Its army was disbanded, and its pride was shattered. Hitler, a failed artist and soldier from the previous war, saw an opportunity. He promised the German people revenge, pride, and prosperity. In 1933, he rose to power, transforming a broken republic into a militarized empire. Meanwhile, the world looked on. Britain and France hoped for peace. Haunted by memories of trenches and gas attacks, the United States turned inward, focusing on its own recovery from the Great Depression. And far to the east, another empire, Japan, was expanding its reach across Asia, driven by dreams of dominance. The first sparks of war began in Poland. On September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled across the border in a lightning-fast assault known as Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. Within weeks, Poland was crushed under the weight of the German army. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but their forces were unprepared for what was coming. The world had entered a storm unlike any before. Cities would burn, nations would fall, and tens of millions would perish. This was not just a war of armies, it was a war of ideology, technology, and survival itself. The Second World War had begun. The invasion of Poland marked the first chapter of humanity's darkest story. In just a few weeks, the German army unleashed a new kind of terror, one the world had never seen before. It was called Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. Fast-moving tanks, roaring aircraft, and coordinated ground assault struck fear into every soldier and civilian who stood in their way. Polish forces fought bravely, outnumbered and outgunned. They charged on horseback against steel machines, their courage unmatched, but their weapons outdated. Villages burned, cities crumbled, and families fled with nothing but hope in their hearts. The German army swept through like a storm, leaving behind only silence and ruins. Then, in the east, came another betrayal. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, invaded Poland from the other side. The Polish people were trapped between two monsters, Hitler and Stalin, as their country was torn apart and divided. There would be no rescue, no mercy, only suffering. While Poland fell, the rest of Europe watched in horror. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but their armies remained still. For months, they waited behind defensive lines, afraid to attack. This period became known as the Phony War, a war declared, but not yet fought. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated. The world's silence fueled his arrogance. The Nazi leader believed destiny was on his side. He dreamed of a greater Germany, one that would dominate all of Europe. And as the winter of 1939 settled over the continent, his generals began to plan their next strike. Far away, across the ocean, America watched from a distance. The people of the United States wanted no part of another European war, but soon, even they would be drawn into the fire. The fall of Poland was not just the beginning of war, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would engulf the entire world. By the spring of 1940, Europe stood trembling under the shadow of the Nazi war machine. After Poland's fall, many believed Hitler would pause, that diplomacy might somehow return peace to the continent. But Hitler had no interest in peace. His eyes turned west, toward the heart of Europe, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At dawn on May 10, 1940, the silence was shattered. German bombers screamed across the skies over Belgium and Holland. Paratroopers descended from above, seizing bridges and roads with terrifying precision. Once again, Blitzkrieg was unleashed fast, ruthless, unstoppable. The Allies were unprepared. The French believed their Maginot Line, a massive wall of fortifications, would protect them. But Hitler's generals outsmarted them. The German army invaded through the Ardennes forest, a region thought to be impassable for tanks. Within days, Nazi forces had broken through the French defenses. cutting the Allied armies in half. British and French troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Surrounded and outnumbered, they faced total annihilation. Yet, in one of the most miraculous moments of the war, hundreds of small civilian boats, fishing vessels, ferries, and private yachts crossed the English Channel to rescue them. This became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Over 300,000 soldiers were saved, escaping the jaws of death to fight another day. But France could not be saved. By June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The City of Lights fell silent. Under the black banners of the swastika, Hitler had achieved what the Kaiser could not: the conquest of France. The world watched in disbelief. Europe was collapsing, one nation after another. Only one stood defiant across the sea: Great Britain. And soon, Hitler would set his sights there next. The war for Europe was far from over. It had only just begun. With France defeated, Hitler stood triumphant across Europe. His armies had crushed nation after nation, and now only one enemy remained: Great Britain, standing alone, battered but unbroken. The island nation prepared for the storm that was coming. In the summer of 1940, Hitler launched Operation Sea Lion, his grand plan to invade Britain. But before German troops could set foot on British soil, the skies had to be conquered. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. Day after day, the Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force, unleashed waves of bombers over British cities. London, Coventry, and countless others burned beneath fiery skies. Yet the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, stood firm. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, took to the skies in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, facing overwhelming odds with unmatched courage. From small airfields hidden across the countryside, these pilots scrambled at a moment's notice, rising into the clouds to meet the enemy. Dogfights erupted above the English Channel, twisting, turning, lethal battles that decided the fate of a nation. Prime Minister Winston Churchill inspired his people with words that would echo through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Despite relentless bombing, Britain refused to break. The Blitz continued for months, but the spirit of the British people never wavered. Families took shelter in underground stations, children sang songs of hope, and firemen battled flames through the night. By October 1940, Hitler's plan to invade Britain had failed. The Luftwaffe had suffered devastating losses, and for the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. The skies over Britain remained free. The Battle of Britain proved that courage and unity could stand against tyranny. Yet, even as the bombs fell silent, a new front of war was already opening far to the east. By mid-1941, Hitler's thirst for conquest seemed endless. Western Europe had fallen, and Britain still stood defiant. But in his mind, the true enemy lay in the east. Hitler believed that defeating the Soviet Union would bring him total dominance over Europe. He called it Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. On the morning of June 22, 1941, without warning, over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed across an 1800-mile front into the Soviet Union. The invasion stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It was a war of annihilation, Hitler's crusade against what he called Bolshevism. The Red Army was caught off guard. Soviet soldiers were overwhelmed by the speed and precision of the German advance. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. As entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken, villages burned, civilians massacred, and the land itself seemed to vanish beneath the steel of the German war machine. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Joseph Stalin, ruthless yet determined, called upon his people to defend their motherland at any cost. Factories were moved eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Men, women, even children joined the war effort. The cry went out across Russia: not one step back. As the months dragged on, Hitler's army advanced deep into Soviet territory, but they had underestimated the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures plunged below 30°C, engines froze, food ran out, and soldiers suffered frostbite in the endless snow. Their summer uniforms offered no protection against the cold. By December, the German advance had reached the outskirts of Moscow, but the Soviets counterattacked with fresh troops from Siberia. For the first time, the German army was forced to retreat. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver the quick victory Hitler promised. Instead, it opened a new, merciless front, one that would become the bloodiest battlefield in human history. The invasion of the Soviet Union had turned into a nightmare. What Hitler thought would take months was now dragging into years. The Eastern Front had become a vast graveyard. Millions of soldiers frozen, starved, or buried beneath the snow. Yet, Hitler refused to retreat. He was obsessed with one goal: capturing the city that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, German armies once again surged eastward. Their tanks roared across the plains, pushing toward the Volga River, determined to seize control of the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that capturing Stalingrad would shatter Soviet morale and secure his victory in the east. But the Soviets knew the importance of the city. Joseph Stalin himself ordered, not a single step back. Stalingrad must be defended at all costs. The battle that followed would become one of the most brutal and deadly in human history. German bombers reduced Stalingrad to rubble, but the ruins only made it easier for the defenders to fight. Soviet soldiers turned every building, every street, every pile of debris into a fortress. The fight was so close that enemies battled room to room, floor to floor, often using knives, grenades, and bare hands. The Volga River became a river of death. Soviet reinforcements crossed under constant fire, many never reaching the other side. Meanwhile, German troops, trapped in the city's ruins, were slowly surrounded. The Soviet army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack that encircled over 300,000 German soldiers. As the winter of 1942-43 set in, the trapped German forces faced starvation and freezing temperatures. Supplies ran out, morale broke, and disease spread through the ranks. Still, Hitler forbade surrender. But on February 2, 1943, German General Friedrich Paulus finally gave in. The once mighty Sixth Army was destroyed. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been decisively defeated. From this moment on, the German army would fight not for conquest, but for survival. While the Eastern Front froze in blood and snow, another war was raging under the burning sun of the African desert. From the golden sands of Libya to the rocky hills of Egypt, armies clashed for control of North Africa, a region vital for the supply routes of the Mediterranean and the oil that fueled the war. In 1940, Italian forces under Benito Mussolini attempted to invade Egypt from Libya, but their attack was weak, poorly planned, and quickly turned into disaster. Seeing his ally in trouble, Hitler sent reinforcements, the legendary Afrika Corps, led by one of his most brilliant commanders, General Erwin Rommel, known to history as the Desert Fox. Rommel's tactics were fast, daring, and unpredictable. His tanks moved like ghosts across the desert, striking hard and vanishing before the enemy could react. British forces, under General Bernard Montgomery, soon realized they were facing a genius of warfare. Battles like Tobruk and Gazala turned the desert into a deadly chessboard, with both sides fighting not only each other, but also the unforgiving elements of nature. Soldiers battled sandstorms that blinded them, heat that scorched their skin, and nights so cold they shivered under the stars. Tanks broke down in the dunes, and water was more precious than bullets. Yet, both armies refused to give in. The turning point came at the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Montgomery's forces, now reinforced and supplied, launched a massive assault. Explosions lit up the desert night as thousands of artillery guns thundered in unison. Rommel fought bravely, but the tide had turned. His army, outnumbered and exhausted, was forced to retreat westward. As the British advanced, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, closing the trap on the Axis forces. By May 1943, the Desert War was over. Germany and Italy had lost North Africa. The victory opened the door for the next great invasion, Italy itself. But the cost had been immense. The desert, once silent and endless, now held the graves of thousands who fought beneath its scorching sun. After the victory in North Africa, the Allies turned their attention to Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. The once proud empire of Benito Mussolini was crumbling. Its armies were defeated abroad, its cities bombed, and its people exhausted by years of war. The time had come to strike at the heart of fascism. On the night of July 9, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Under a moonlit sky, thousands of paratroopers descended behind enemy lines while Allied ships unleashed a massive bombardment from the sea. British and American troops stormed the beaches, fighting through heat, dust, and fierce resistance. The German and Italian defenders fought hard, but the Allies were unstoppable. Within weeks, Sicily was captured. The loss of Sicily shook Italy to its core. The Italian people had lost faith in Mussolini. His promises of glory had brought only ruin. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III ordered Mussolini's arrest. The man who once dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire was dragged away in disgrace. But the war in Italy was far from over. Hitler reacted immediately, sending German forces to occupy the country. They freed Mussolini from prison and installed him as the puppet ruler of a new fascist state in the north. The southern half of Italy, meanwhile, surrendered to the Allies. The once united nation was now divided and bleeding. In September 1943, Allied troops landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno and later advanced toward Naples and Rome. The fighting was brutal. Every hill, every street, every mountain pass turned into a fortress defended by German soldiers. The Italian campaign became a slow, grinding struggle. Cities were destroyed, civilians suffered, and soldiers faced mud, rain, and relentless enemy fire. Yet, the Allies pressed on. For them, Italy was not just another battlefield. It was the gateway to liberating Europe. By June 1944, Rome finally fell. The Eternal City was free again. Mussolini's dream was over, and his empire lay in ruins. But even as the Allies celebrated in Italy, a far greater storm was gathering, the one that would decide the fate of the entire world. After the victory in North Africa, the Allies turned their attention to Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. The once proud empire of Benito Mussolini was crumbling. Its armies were defeated abroad, its cities bombed, and its people exhausted by years of war. The time had come to strike at the heart of fascism. On the night of July 9, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Under a moonlit sky, thousands of paratroopers descended behind enemy lines while Allied ships unleashed a massive bombardment from the sea. British and American troops stormed the beaches, fighting through heat, dust, and fierce resistance. The German and Italian defenders fought hard, but the Allies were unstoppable. Within weeks, Sicily was captured. The loss of Sicily shook Italy to its core. The Italian people had lost faith in Mussolini. His promises of glory had brought only ruin. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III ordered Mussolini's arrest. The man who once dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire was dragged away in disgrace. But the war in Italy was far from over. Hitler reacted immediately, sending German forces to occupy the country. They freed Mussolini from prison and installed him as the puppet ruler of a new fascist state in the north. The southern half of Italy, meanwhile, surrendered to the Allies. The once united nation was now divided and bleeding. In September 1943, Allied troops landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno and later advanced toward Naples and Rome. The fighting was brutal. Every hill, every street, every mountain pass turned into a fortress defended by German soldiers. The Italian campaign became a slow, grinding struggle. Cities were destroyed, civilians suffered, and soldiers faced mud, rain, and relentless enemy fire. Yet, the Allies pressed on. For them, Italy was not just another battlefield, it was the gateway to liberating Europe. By June 1944, Rome finally fell. The Eternal City was free again. Mussolini's dream was over, and his empire lay in ruins. But even as the Allies celebrated in Italy, a far greater storm was gathering, the one that would decide the fate of the entire world. The beaches of Normandy had been won, but the road to freedom was far from over. The Allies now faced the monumental task of liberating an entire nation from Nazi control. France had suffered under occupation for 4 long years, its cities scarred, its people oppressed, its spirit tested. But now, hope had returned. After the success of D-Day, Allied troops began their slow and bloody advance through the hedgerows and villages of northern France. The German army fought ferociously, turning every town into a fortress. Fields were mined, roads were ambushed, and snipers hid among the ruins. Progress was measured not in miles, but in meters, each one paid for with blood. Then came the Battle of Caen, brutal struggle that raged for weeks. British and Canadian forces fought street by street, determined to break the German line. Tanks clashed amid burning buildings as the skies thundered with Allied bombers overhead. Eventually, Caen fell and the Allies pushed forward. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton's Third Army broke through German defenses in the west, racing across the French countryside with lightning speed. Villages cheered as American tanks rolled through, waving flags and throwing flowers to the soldiers. The people of France could finally see liberation with their own eyes. But Hitler refused to let go. He ordered his generals to counterattack at Falaise, hoping to trap the Allies. The plan failed disastrously. The Falaise pocket became a slaughter. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured as their armies collapsed in chaos. By August 25, 1944, the impossible had happened. Paris was free. French resistance fighters, joined by Allied troops, rose up and drove out the last of the German occupiers. As the bells of Notre Dame Cathedral rang, crowds flooded the streets, embracing the liberators with tears and cheers. General Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." The liberation of France marked a turning point in the war. The Allies had reclaimed Western Europe, and the road to Germany was now open. But ahead lay the most brutal chapter of all, the battle for the heart of the Reich itself. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned completely. The Allies had liberated France. The Soviets were advancing from the east, and the walls of Hitler's empire were closing in. Yet the Nazi regime refused to surrender. Hitler still believed in one final miracle, one last strike that could turn defeat into victory. That strike came in the frozen forests of Belgium, in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, under the cover of fog and snow, German forces launched a surprise offensive against the unsuspecting Allies. Tanks rolled through the Ardennes forest, smashing into thin American lines. It was Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The attack caught the Allies off guard. American troops, surrounded and outnumbered, fought with incredible courage. At the town of Bastogne, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division held their ground against relentless assaults. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single, legendary reply: "Nuts." For weeks, the battle raged in bitter cold. Snow fell thick, visibility was near zero, and the frozen ground was littered with wrecked tanks and fallen soldiers. But the Allies refused to break. General Patton's Third Army moved with astonishing speed, driving north to relieve Bastogne. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. The bulge in the Allied lines was crushed. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. The last of their reserves tanks, fuel, and men were gone. The dream of victory had died in the snow. The Allies were now ready to strike deep into Germany itself. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly. City after city fell: Warsaw, Budapest, Nigsburg. The once invincible Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. Millions of refugees fled westward, desperate to escape the Soviet advance. Inside his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler raged against reality. His empire, once stretching across Europe, was collapsing before his eyes. The thousand-year Reich was in its final days. The fall of the Third Reich had begun, and soon, the world would witness the end of the most destructive regime in human history. By April 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was collapsing. From the east, the Soviet Red Army thundered toward Berlin, crushing everything in its path. From the west, the Allied forces under Eisenhower advanced through Germany, liberating towns, freeing prisoners, and uncovering the full horror of Nazi crimes. The world's final battle against tyranny was about to be fought in the heart of Hitler's empire. Berlin, once a proud capital, had become a city of ruins. Streets were filled with rubble, buildings reduced to skeletons of steel and stone. Air raids pounded the city day and night. Civilians hid in cellars, children cried in the darkness, and the once loyal citizens of the Reich now only prayed for survival. Deep beneath the city, in a reinforced concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to face reality. Surrounded by his generals and a shrinking circle of loyal followers, he ranted about non-existent armies and imaginary victories. His health was failing, his voice shaking, but his madness burned stronger than ever. As the Red Army encircled Berlin, Soviet artillery unleashed a storm of fire. The final battle began. House by house, street by street, soldiers fought in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Flames engulfed entire blocks, and the ground trembled under constant bombardment. Every hour, the front line moved closer to the bunker. Hitler's once loyal officers began abandoning him. Heinrich Himmler tried to negotiate secretly with the Allies, and Joseph Goebbels urged the Führer to die rather than surrender. Hitler, realizing the end had come, married Eva Braun inside the bunker on April 29, 1945. The next day, with Soviet troops only blocks away, Hitler and Eva took their own lives. Their bodies were burned, as per his orders, in the courtyard above. The following days saw the final collapse. On May 2, 1945, Berlin fell. Soviet soldiers raised their red flag atop the Reichstag, symbolizing the death of Nazi Germany. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The dictator who promised 1,000 years of glory had brought only 12 years of destruction, death, and despair. The city that once represented the power of the Reich now stood as a graveyard of ashes, a reminder of the terrible price of human ambition and hate. While Europe burned, another brutal war raged across the Pacific. Long before Hitler fell, the Empire of Japan had unleashed its fury upon Asia and the Western powers. Driven by a vision of domination and fueled by desperation for resources, Japan sought to create a vast, Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a polite name for conquest. On December 7, 1941, the world changed forever. At dawn, hundreds of Japanese aircraft roared out of the clouds over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In minutes, explosions shattered the quiet harbor. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, Hitler declared war on America. The global conflict had truly become World War II. Japan's early victories came swiftly and brutally. Their forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Philippines. In one of the darkest moments, thousands of American and Filipino prisoners were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March, where starvation, exhaustion, and cruelty claimed thousands of lives. But as in Europe, Japan's triumphs would not last. The turning point came in 1942, at the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers cracked Japanese communications, allowing the U.S. Navy to ambush the Japanese fleet. 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, the heart of its navy, were destroyed in a single battle. It was a stunning defeat that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. From that moment, the Allies began their long, brutal campaign of island hop. Each island was a fortress, defended fiercely by Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender. Battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were fought at unimaginable cost. Soldiers waded through blood-soaked beaches, jungles turned to graveyards, and the skies filled with burning planes. By 1944, the United States had begun bombing the Japanese homeland. Entire cities were reduced to ashes. Yet Japan would not yield. The war in the Pacific had become a fight not only for territory, but for survival, for honor, and for revenge. The Empire of Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, and now that giant was coming for them. By 1943, the tide in the Pacific was beginning to turn. The once unstoppable Japanese war machine was now being pushed back island by island, battle by battle. The United States Navy, rebuilt and strengthened, ruled the seas. American aircraft carriers, bristling with planes and power, became floating fortresses of vengeance. The Allies' new strategy was called island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, U.S. forces targeted key strategic positions, stepping stones across the Pacific, that would bring them closer to Japan. The fighting was brutal, the conditions nightmarish. The first great test came at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. For months, U.S. Marines battled disease, exhaustion, and a fanatical enemy who refused to surrender. The jungle was alive with danger. Snipers, ambushes, and constant bombardment. The air above became known as the slot, where American and Japanese planes clashed daily in deadly dogfights. After 6 months of hell, the U.S. finally secured victory. From there, the Allied forces surged forward through Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Guam. Each island became a graveyard of soldiers. The Japanese fought to the last man, often choosing death over capture. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, many forced into tragic mass suicides by Japanese propaganda. At Saipan, the cost was enormous. When American troops raised their flag over the island, they knew they were only 1,200 miles from Japan itself. The war was entering its most desperate phase. Meanwhile, the skies belonged to the Americans. B-29 bombers began launching devastating raids on Japanese cities, turning them into firestorms of destruction. Factories, ports, and neighborhoods burned under relentless attacks. Still, Japan refused to yield. As the Allies closed in, one island loomed ahead, a small volcanic rock that would become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, Iwo Jima. There, both nations would fight not just for victory, but for history itself. The tide had turned. The hunter had become the hunted, but the road to victory would demand a price in blood that few could imagine. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its most brutal and tragic phase. The Allies were closing in on Japan itself, and two small islands stood between them and the homeland, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each would become a nightmare of fire, steel, and sacrifice. The island of Iwo Jima was little more than 8 square miles of volcanic rock, but its airfields made it a crucial target. Capturing it would allow U.S. bombers to attack Japan more effectively and provide a safe landing site for damaged aircraft returning from missions. On February 19, 1945, the assault began. Before dawn, over 30,000 U.S. Marines stormed the black sand beaches under relentless Japanese fire. The defenders were hidden in a maze of tunnels and bunkers carved deep into the island. Machine guns blazed, mortars exploded, and the air filled with smoke and screams. The battle raged for more than a month. Every inch of ground was fought over. The cost was staggering: nearly 7,000 Americans killed and over 20,000 wounded. Almost all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders died. But from the ashes rose one of the most iconic moments of the entire war: the raising of the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph captured not victory alone, but the courage and sacrifice of every soldier who fought there. Yet the bloodiest battle still lay ahead: Okinawa. This island was Japan's last line of defense before the mainland. Beginning in April 1945, over 500,000 Allied troops faced fierce resistance from Japanese soldiers and kamikaze pilots who hurled themselves into suicide attacks. Entire ships were torn apart by explosions. Skies turned black with smoke. For 82 days, Okinawa was hell on earth. Civilians were trapped in the chaos, many forced to take their own lives rather than face capture. By the time it ended in June, more than 200,000 people were dead. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike. The victory came at an unbearable cost. The Allies now stood on Japan's doorstep, but both sides knew what that meant. If the invasion of Japan took place, millions more could die. The world stood at the edge of an unimaginable decision, one that would change history forever. The spring of 1945 brought both hope and horror. In Europe, the guns had fallen silent, Hitler was dead, and Germany had surrendered. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. Japan refused to yield. Every city bombed, every army shattered. Yet still the empire fought on, ready to sacrifice everything in the name of honor. The Allied leaders knew what that meant. An invasion of Japan would cost millions of lives, American, Japanese, and civilian alike. The war had already consumed the world for 6 long years. The question was simple, but terrifying. How much longer could humanity endure this? In the deserts of New Mexico, a secret weapon had been born, one that could end the war in a single stroke. It was called the Manhattan Project, and its creation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Scientists from across the globe had gathered to harness the power of the atom, a force so immense it could destroy entire cities in seconds. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested. A blinding flash lit the desert sky, followed by a mushroom cloud that climbed miles high. Witnesses stood in stunned silence. One scientist whispered words that would echo through history. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, President Harry S. Truman made the most consequential decision in human history: to end the war and to save lives, as he believed he authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay flew over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy fell. A moment later, the city was gone. A fireball brighter than the sun tore through Hiroshima, leveling everything within miles. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Those who survived faced burns, radiation, and suffering beyond comprehension. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, struck Nagasaki. Once again, devastation beyond imagination. In the span of just 3 days, over 200,000 lives were lost. The world had entered the nuclear age, an age where humanity held the power to destroy itself. 5 days later, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people for the first time. His voice trembled as he announced Japan's surrender. The war, the deadliest ever fought, was finally over. But as the smoke cleared, the world realized something profound. In ending one war, humanity had unleashed a weapon that could end all wars, and perhaps civilization itself. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world exhaled not in victory, but in disbelief. The deadliest war in human history was over. Yet what remained was not triumph, but ruin. Cities lay in ashes, nations were broken, and over 70 million lives had been lost. Across Europe, the landscape was unrecognizable. Once great capitals like Berlin, Warsaw, and London were piles of rubble. Entire families were gone, their names erased by bombs and fire. The survivors wandered through the ruins searching for food, shelter, or the faces of loved ones who would never return. In Japan, the devastation was beyond imagination. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were no longer cities, they were shadows burned into the earth. Radiation claimed lives for years after the bombs fell. The emperor who had once called his people to conquer the world now told them to rebuild from ashes. The war had redrawn the map of humanity. Germany was divided, the Allies controlling the West, the Soviets controlling the East. Europe had survived fascism, only to find itself caught in a new struggle, a Cold War between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Millions of refugees crossed borders seeking safety. Soldiers returned home as heroes or as broken souls haunted by what they had seen. In the concentration camps, Allied forces uncovered horror beyond comprehension, piles of bones, skeletal survivors, and evidence of genocide that shocked the world. The full scale of the Holocaust was finally revealed: 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. In Nuremberg, justice was served. The surviving Nazi leaders were tried for their crimes against peace, humanity, and civilization itself. The world swore it would never allow such evil again. But the war had changed more than borders and politics. It had changed humanity. Science had unleashed the atom, and the balance of power had shifted forever. The United Nations was born, a fragile hope that nations might finally work together to prevent another global catastrophe. For those who lived through it, the memories never faded. The faces of the fallen, the sound of bombs, the silence after destruction, they carried it for the rest of their lives. World War II had ended, but the scars it left would shape the next century and remind humanity that peace is the most fragile victory of all. In the quiet years after the chaos, the world began to ask itself one haunting question: why? Why had humanity come so close to destroying itself? Why had millions died for the ambitions of a few? And could such horror ever happen again? World War II was not just a story of armies and nations. It was a story of human nature. It revealed both the darkest depths and the greatest courage within mankind. The same species that built gas chambers also built bridges of peace. The same hands that dropped bombs also rebuilt cities from the rubble. The war taught the world many lessons. Lessons written not in ink, but in blood. It taught that hatred and racism left unchecked can consume entire civilizations. It showed that power without conscience leads only to destruction. And it proved that the price of freedom is eternal. Vigilance for tyranny does not die. It waits in silence for its next chance. But amid the ruins, there was also rebirth. The defeated nations, Germany and Japan, rose again, not as conquerors, but as builders. They transformed from symbols of war into symbols of peace, democracy, and progress. From the ashes of hate, they created new futures based on cooperation and humanity. The United Nations was formed, a fragile but vital hope that the world could speak before it fought, unite before it burned. Treaties, alliances, and global cooperation began to take shape. The phrase, "never again," became not just a promise, but a prayer whispered by every generation that followed. Yet even as the world moved forward, the shadow of war lingered. The nuclear age had begun, and with it, the possibility of annihilation on a scale even greater than before. The lessons of the past became warnings for the future. World War II reminded humanity that evil is not born overnight, it grows slowly, in silence, when good people look away, and that the true victory of mankind lies not in weapons or empires, but in compassion, understanding, and peace. The deadliest war ever fought became the greatest teacher ever known. Its message remains clear: remember what was lost so that it is never lost again. When the fires of World War II finally burned out, a new dawn rose, but it was not the peace the world had dreamed of. Instead of unity, a line divided the planet. On one side stood the United States, champion of democracy and capitalism. On the other stood the Soviet Union, fortress of communism. Allies in war had become rivals in peace. The world, exhausted by one conflict, now entered another, the Cold War. The ruins of Europe became the stage for a new kind of battle, one fought not with armies, but with ideology, spies, and fear. From Berlin, where a wall of concrete and barbed wire would soon rise, to the jungles of Asia, the struggle for influence began. In 1947, the United States announced the Marshall Plan, a massive effort to rebuild Europe and stop the spread of communism. Food, money, and machinery flowed into Western Europe, helping nations rise from the ashes. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on the East. forming satellite states behind what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. The world split into two camps, NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. The fear of nuclear war hung over every decision, every confrontation, with both sides possessing atomic weapons. One mistake could mean the end of civilization. In this tense new era, the battle for hearts and minds spread far beyond Europe. Conflicts erupted in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, as each superpower sought to shape the post-war world in its own image. The Cold War was not about conquering land, it was about conquering the future. At the same time, humanity took its first steps into the unknown. Science and technology born from the fires of war now carried mankind to the stars. The space race began, as the US and the Soviet Union competed to prove their superiority, not just on Earth, but beyond it. The victory of 1945 had ended one nightmare, but it had birthed another kind of fear, silent, invisible, and ever-present. For the first time, humans lived under the shadow of weapons capable of ending all life. The war that had begun with bullets and bombs ended with the threat of buttons and missiles. The deadliest war ever fought had changed everything: the balance of power, the course of nations, and the destiny of humankind. 80 years have passed since the final gun fell silent. The veterans have grown old, the battlefields have grown quiet, and the ruins have turned to cities once more. Yet the shadow of World War II still stretches across our world, not as darkness, but as a reminder of what humanity is capable of, both in destruction and in hope. The war reshaped everything: nations, borders, beliefs, and even the human spirit. From its ashes rose the modern world we live in today. The United Nations was formed to give peace a voice. The idea of human rights became a global promise, a declaration that every life, every nation, mattered. The European Union emerged from former enemies who swore to never fight again. Germany and Japan, once symbols of aggression, became nations of innovation and peace. The technologies born from wartime radar, jet engines, rockets, nuclear energy, computers would go on to define the next century. Medicine, communication, and science all advanced because of lessons learned in pain. Even space exploration, which took humanity to the moon, began with the same rockets that once carried weapons of war. But the greatest legacy was not in machines or politics, it was in memory. The memory of the Holocaust, of Hiroshima, of every soldier who never came home. Those memories became warnings carved into the soul of humanity. They remind us that peace is not given, it is earned, protected, and renewed with every generation. The war also taught us that evil does not begin with violence. It begins with silence, with indifference, with the belief that some lives matter less than others. And so, every year, when the world remembers the fallen, it remembers that freedom, justice, and humanity must never again be taken for granted. World War II was the deadliest war ever fought, but also the most defining. It tore the world apart, only for it to be rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and more united. The men and women who lived through it gave us a lesson greater than any victory, that even in the darkest night, humanity can find the strength to rise again. The story of the war is not just history, it is a mirror, showing us what we can become, and what we must never become again. And as the last echoes of that war fade into time, one truth remains unshaken: the price of peace will always be less than the cost of war.